35 years have elapsed since capital punishment has been inflicted in the town of Dumfries, and we would fain see Dumfries spared the repetition of so painful an event, which is rendered doubly painful by the sex of the criminal. This statement in the Glasgow Herald on Wednesday the 16th of April 1862 mirrored what many were thinking following 40-year-old Anne Hannah's murderer Mary Timney being found guilty and sentenced to execution by hanging, especially as Mary Timney had continued to plead her innocence and her guilt being found only through circumstantial evidence. However, within days of this statement appearing in the Glasgow Herald, a confession would change many people's minds. Before I get into the story, here's a promo from ODFM, which is a fellow Darkcast Network podcast and is hosted by Jenna and Kelly.
Hey there, true crime fans. Are you looking for a podcast that combines your love of crime stories with a good laugh? Look no further than the ODFM podcast. ODFM is the podcast that brings you true crime and comedy in a way you've never heard before. It's hosted by the dynamic duo of Kelly DeVries and Jenna Swanson, the kinds of friends who make inappropriate jokes and laugh at times they probably shouldn't. Kelly and Jenna take you on a wild ride with their unique blend of humor and gripping storytelling. From bizarre murders to unsolved mysteries, they delve deep into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld, all while keeping it light with their quick wit and relatable banter. With each episode, Kelly and Jenna bring something new and exciting to the table. No case is too small, too strange, or too scary for them to handle. So, what are you waiting for? Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts and join the ODFM community. ODFM, where true crime meets comedy and the laughs are killer.
According to Wikipedia, the Glenkins is located midway along the western section of the Southern Upland Way in the historic county of Kirkcudbrightshire and is made up of 5 parishes, including Dalry. Kirkcudbrightshire covered an area in the southwest of Scotland until 1975, when it became part of what is now Dumfries and Galloway. The small settlement of Dalry lies on what back in 1862 was known as the Glenkins Road, and about 3 miles from Dalry, on the same narrow road, was Carsfad, where 2 small stone cottages sat, which consisted of a kitchen with a bed in it and a separate bedroom, and they stood about 50 yards apart. And they housed the Timneys, Francis Timney, who was a road surfaceman, his wife, 27-year-old Mary Timney, and their 4 children, and they'd moved to the cottage sometime between 1859 and 1860. And the Hannahs, brothers William, who was the tenant of the farm at Carsfad, and a farmer, Lockhart, who was a labourer, and 40-year-old Anne, who kept the cottage for her 2 brothers. The cottage that the Timneys lived in was being sublet by the Hannah's mother, who had died in June 1862. The next nearest dwelling along this same road was a porter lodge house at Knocknalling, about a quarter of a mile away. On Tuesday the 13th of January 1862, both the Timney and Hannah families were up early getting ready for the day ahead. While Mary Timney got her 4 children washed and fed, her husband Francis went next door to the Hannahs about 7 a.m. and asked William if he could borrow a small amount of money from him, promising to pay it back as soon as he could. The men had a good enough relationship, despite the Hannahs having a tumultuous relationship with his wife Mary, and so William agreed, and Francis left and went to work. The relationship between the Hannahs and Mary appeared to have broken down due to the Hannahs not being willing to lend Mary money or tea, and due to the refusal to let Mary gather wood from their farm. Apparently, about 4 weeks prior, Mary and Anne had had 2 separate quarrels about the situation, but things seemed to have settled down and no further quarrels had transpired since. After William and Lockhart had finished breakfast, they both left their cottage about 8:40 a.m. to travel the 2 or 3 miles to their place of work for the day, where they stayed and worked until sometime about 1 o'clock, when they received word that their sister Anne was quite unwell and they were to return home immediately. William dashing home first, with Lockhart following quickly behind with their horse and cart. After Anne Hannah had seen her brothers, William and Lockhart, off to work, she began to clear the breakfast dishes away, tidy the kitchen and get some clothes washed, before about 9:30 a.m. taking a break and getting some fresh air at the front door briefly when she saw some local school children making their way to the school about a quarter of a mile further along the road. Although before Anne went back into the house, she saw two of the school children going into the Timney cottage. But Anne just tutted, shook her head and returned inside to continue the day's work. Around about 11:30 a.m, Anne then left her cottage again and made her way to the Hannah's woodpile to stock up for the fire that evening, only to find her neighbour, Mary Timney, also on the way there, which incensed Anne, because this was their woodpile, not for the Timneys' use, and so Anne reminded Mary of this, which resulted in the pair not only exchanging high words, but also blows, before Mary stormed off back to her cottage, as did Anne to carry on working in her cottage after she'd stocked up on firewood. 40-year-old Anne Hannah was found not long after 12:30 p.m. by Agnes McClellan, lying face down on her kitchen floor in a pool of blood. Agnes McClellan, sometimes known as Nanny, lived in a neighbouring village about 1.5 miles from the two cottages at Carrsfad with her father. Agnes was a kind of helper, and many of the local women would call on Agnes's services when they needed. Agnes knew both the Hannahs and the Timneys, and Agnes had actually helped the Hannahs by taking care of the Hannahs' cottage and William and Lockhart when Anne had left for a few days to see family. On Tuesday the 13th of January 1862, Agnes had awoken early as usual to begin working in her house, before sometime before 12 noon receiving a message, presumably sent via a child, from Mary Timney, asking her to come to her cottage that very day in order to bake cakes for her. Agnes finished off what she was doing before making her way to the cottages at Carrsfad, arriving there shortly after 12:30 p.m. As the Timneys' cottage was after the Hannahs' cottage, Agnes thought she would pop in and say hello to Anne on her way past. Agnes noted immediately that one side half of Anne's front door was open, and so she called out and went inside, making her way to the kitchen door, which was almost shut. Receiving no answer from Anne, Agnes pushed open the kitchen door and froze. She could not believe what she was seeing. Anne on the kitchen floor, with both of her arms underneath her body and pools of blood all over the floor. Shocked, Agnes said out loud, according to the Morning Post on the 10th of April, "Dear me, Anne, what's ado?" Anne was still breathing at this point, but was unable to reply, and so Agnes fled from the cottage and ran immediately to the Knocknalling lodge house where Robert and Elizabeth Coates lived, about 1/4 mile away. Upon Agnes arriving at the lodge and telling Robert and Elizabeth Coates what had occurred, a message was sent to Anne's brothers, William and Lockhart, telling them to come home immediately, as well as to the local doctor and police officer, before Robert and Elizabeth, Agnes, and John McAdam, who was visiting the Coates, made their way back to the Carrsfad cottages. Back at the Carrsfad cottages, Mary Timney was waiting patiently for Agnes to turn up to bake cakes for her. But with no sign of Agnes yet, Mary went to her door to have a look out to see if she could see Agnes coming along the road. Instead, though, Mary saw Robert and Elizabeth Coates, Mr. McAdam, and Agnes hurrying into Anne Hannah's cottage. Curious, Mary slowly made her way to Anne's cottage too, to see what was going on, and upon entering the kitchen of the Hannah's cottage and seeing Anne and the pools of blood, said, "Dear me, Nanny, I think the like of this was never seen before," to which Agnes replied, "I think not." As Mary stood in the kitchen of the Hannah's cottage, she watched as Robert Coates lifted Anne from the floor, with blood flowing from her head, and laid Anne gently on her bed in the kitchen, at which point Anne said, "Oh dear," before falling unconscious again. While everyone waited for Anne's brothers, the doctor and the police officer to arrive, they all took note of the state of the kitchen and Anne. It was noted that Anne's cap had been removed from her head and was lying on the floor, and that her hair was all bloody. There was also a butcher's knife lying on the floor where Anne had been, which was covered in blood, as well as a poker on the floor, which was also found to have blood and what looked like Anne's hair on it. The knife was used by William to kill pigs, and the poker was used for the kitchen fire. The uneven kitchen floor had clots and pools of blood over it, but the blood had dried where it was thin. It was also noted that there was a spattering of blood on the table and chairs. However, the furniture did not look as if it had been disturbed, and there were damp clothes found lying on the floor, as if Anne had been wringing the newly washed clothes and had been disturbed. During this time, Mr. McAdam also asked Mary Timney if she had heard or seen anything, to which Mary had replied that she hadn't, with Mr. McAdam commenting at the time and later that it was strange to him that someone living so close to where a brutal attack had taken place had heard nothing. Mary had replied that she hadn't been very well and that this was her first time out of the house that day. Due to how far away Anne's brothers were working, William did not arrive back to the cottage until about 3 p.m, and Lockhart about an hour or so afterwards. When William arrived at the cottage, he was shocked to find his sister unconscious and having been so savagely attacked, but he was also shocked and annoyed to find Mary Timney there, since he knew that she and his sister had had fights previously, and so he told her to go home, that she was doing no good, at which point Mary left, after having been in the Hannah's cottage since Anne had been found almost 2 hours prior. Once Mary had left the cottage, William turned to the doctor, Dr. Jackson, who had arrived about half an hour before William to find Anne senseless and in a dying state, to find out about the injuries Anne had sustained. Upon examining Anne, Dr. Jackson found her head to be covered in blood, to have 7 wounds on her head and 3 on her face, which he stated had been inflicted by a blunt instrument, and were very serious, and were sufficient to account for the state he had found Anne in when he had arrived. Dr. Jackson advised that he found no other injuries on Anne other than her head and face. He also stated at the time that from looking at the blood and how it had coagulated, he estimated that the attack couldn't have taken place any more than a few hours prior. Sadly, Anne never regained consciousness again and died in the bed in her kitchen cottage about 9:30 p.m. that night. Following doctors Jackson, Shand and Millman carrying out a post-mortem 2 days later, the cause of death was determined to have been due to a compound fracture of the skull, and that Anne's ribs were also broken, a fact that Dr. Jackson didn't notice at the time of his initial examination of Anne, and that a poker could have been the weapon of use to break her ribs. All 3 doctors stated that none of the wounds found on Anne could have been self-inflicted or have been caused by a person falling on the stone floor during a struggle, but that someone else would have had to have attacked Anne in order to explain the wounds that had been found. Following the local police officer receiving word that Anne had been brutally attacked in her home, he too arrived at the Hannah's cottage and was present when Anne sadly died. But he had already started looking for Anne's attacker and murderer long before Anne had died, and what he had heard while being present in the Hannah's kitchen for a number of hours gave him a pretty good idea where he was going to start, and so a search of Mary Timney's cottage was his first port of call. During this search, he found hidden a damp from being washed green tartan dress with a red stripe and a petticoat, both of which displayed stains and markings and belonged to Mary Timney, and it was proven that she had been wearing the very same tartan dress and petticoat on the morning of Anne's attack, following speaking to witnesses. But even better than that, a beetle, or mallet, was also found in the Timney cottage. It too had been washed, but it was still stained with blood, and there was hair, similar in colour to Anne's, still on it. Not long after Anne Hannah had passed away, Mary Timney was arrested for her murder. She vehemently pleaded her innocence, saying that she had no idea what had happened to Anne, and no idea why she hadn't heard anything while Anne was being attacked. That yes, they had had their differences, but she'd been ill that day. The first time she'd been out that day was when she had seen Agnes and the Coateses going into Anne's cottage, and she went to see what was going on. That was the first she knew Anne had even been attacked. And she also denied any knowledge of the beetle or mallet, or how it had got into her house, and why it was stained with blood. Despite all these pleas, Mary Timney was arrested on the evening Anne died, and taken to the local jail to be questioned, and a declaration to be taken, which she gave denying all knowledge of Anne's attack and murder. She continued to be questioned, and 3 days later she gave another declaration, stating the same, denying all knowledge of the crime. However, it was felt by the police that they had enough evidence, circumstantial as it may be, as nobody had actually seen Mary Timney enter Anne's cottage or commit the awful act, and so Mary Timney was kept in jail and committed to a murder trial sometime in April. However, 3 weeks after Anne's attack and murder, Mary Timney gave another declaration. This time, though, she named her own mother as being the person who had committed the horrible attack, going as far as relaying an apparent conversation that had passed between Mary Timney and her mother following her mother apparently attacking and subsequently killing Anne Hannah. This, however, was quickly disproved, as there were many witnesses who could place Mary's mother miles away from Carlsbad that day, and so once again all suspicion was firmly on Mary Timney, despite her denial. The 2-day murder trial began on the 8th of April 1862, with Judge Lord Deas presiding, with Mary Timney facing the charge of, on the 13th of January 1862, having wickedly and ferociously attacked and assaulted Anne Hannah with a poker or piece of iron, a large butcher's knife, and a heavy wooden mallet or beetle or some other lethal weapon, striking Anne several times about the head, face, and other parts of her body, where Anne Hannah had been cut, bruised, and received a fractured skull, and was mortally injured and died a short while afterwards. It was said in the Morning Post that Mary Timney had appeared vacant and unconcerned as she had replied that she was not guilty of this crime. Taking to the stand to give their account of the fateful day were Agnes McClellan, Robert and Elizabeth Coates, John McAdam, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Shand, Dr. Millman, William and Lockhart Hannah, and the police officer John Robson, who had searched the Timneys' home and arrested Mary Timney. Also taking to the stand were 2 sisters, Jane and Margaret Barber, who had been the 2 girls Anne Hannah had seen going into Mary Timney's home on the morning of her murder. The 2 girls, both being under 10 years old, told of how they had gone into the Timneys' cottage on their way to school on the morning Anne had been attacked, and that Mary had been wearing a green tartan dress with a red stripe, the same dress that the police officer later found damp, having been washed. Also taking to the stand were 2 of Mary Timney's children. There was Susan Timney, who was also just under 10 years old, and she told the judge that she remembered the day that Anne had been killed, saying that her dad had gone to work as normal, that her mother had been wearing a green tartan dress with a red stripe and a petticoat, that her mum had left the house early to feed the pigs, and then the Barber girls had come to their home before going to school. She then said on the stand that after the Barber girls had left the cottage, her mother did not go out again. However, it was put to her that when she had been asked prior to the trial if her mother had left the cottage after the Barber girls had gone, she had said that her mother had left the cottage, and in fact had gone to the Hannah's cottage that morning. Susan admitted that she remembered saying this, and that it had been true. Her mother had left the cottage after the Barber girls had gone, and that her mother had come back again soon afterwards, going on to say that she did not see anything particularly different about her mother's tartan dress. Susan also confirmed for the court that her grandmother had not been at the cottage that day at all, as her mother Mary Timney had suggested, and many other witnesses also took to the stand to provide an alibi for Mary Timney's mother. Mary Timney's next youngest daughter, Margaret, aged about 5 or 6, was also called to the stand. However, when she answered the first question of "How old are you?" by saying "I dinna ken," she was allowed to quickly leave the stand again. Also taking to the stand over the 2-day trial were experts who could only attest that the stains and hair found on the mallet, poker, knife and clothing was blood of some mammalia, and that blood of a human being can't with certainty be distinguished from that of any other of the mammalia. Following the prosecution's case being presented and them summing up, Mary Timney's counsel then addressed the jury, as the defence had no evidence or witnesses to present, other than Mary Timney's insistence that she did not have anything to do with Anne Hannah's murder, that she had never seen the mallet or beetle before that had been found in her home with the blood on it, it certainly didn't belong to her, and that she had heard nothing the day of the attack and murder of Anne Hannah. Mr. Cowan, Mary Timney's counsel, put it to the jury that the Crown had failed to prove that Mary Timney was guilty of Anne Hannah's murder, but added that if in fact she was guilty of the attack, then in his view, the jury should return a verdict of culpable homicide instead of murder, as it had not been proven, as far as he was concerned, that the mallet found in Mary Timney's house was ever used in the attack against Anne, and therefore any attack had not been premeditated, as any weapon used had been at hand in the kitchen of the Hannah's own home. The judge then laid down the job of the jury, which was to decide whether the wounds Anne Hannah had died from were self-inflicted or inflicted by another, whether Mary Timney was the person who had attacked and killed Anne, and if they determined it had been Mary Timney who had attacked and killed Anne, if they deemed it to be murder or culpable homicide. The jury then retired for 20 minutes before returning and unanimously finding 27-year-old Mary Timney guilty of murder. And despite the jury knowing that the outcome of their verdict would mean Mary Timney would be hanged, they made no recommendations for reprieve. According to the Carlisle Journal, on the 11th of April 1862, Judge Lord Deas then turned to Mary Timney and spoke with a stunned court in silence. He said it was impossible for anybody who heard the evidence to expect that there should have been any other verdict. There now remains for me to pronounce upon you the last sentence of the law. At which point Mary Timney said, "My lord, it never was me. It never was me." But Lord Deas ignored her pleas and said, "The time of all of us in this world is short. With most of us it is uncertain, but it is certainly short in your case. Your days are numbered. They must indeed be few." This time Mary Timney wailed, "No, my lord, no, my lord." The judge continued, however, by saying, "I recommend you use well those few days which you have to live." Mary Timney cried again, "No, no, give me anything but that. Let the Lord send for me." With Lord Deas replying, "You will have ministers to attend you, and all the consolations of religion will be afforded you, if you choose to accept them. The first step for you with that view is a sincere repentance. I recommend you to use the short time you have still in this world to make your peace with God. I should betray my duty and hold out false hope to you if I gave you the slightest hope that the sentence of the law might not literally be carried into effect." But still Mary Timney pleaded one last time. "No, my lord, give me for ever a prison. Dinna do that." But Mary Timney's pleas fell on deaf ears, and Lord Deas donned the black cap and formally passed the sentence of execution, with a date being set for the 29th of April. At this point, perhaps it had finally sunk in that she was going to be executed, and Mary Timney became pale, and when Lord Deas had concluded, she tearfully cried, "Oh, my wains! My lord, dinna do that! Oh, dinna do that! I'll no go out! Oh, my wains! Dinna do that!" Again Mary Timney's pleas fell on deaf ears, and she was led, still crying, down the trap from the courtroom, but her wails could still be heard as she went, "My wains! My wains!" with many finding the scene so harrowing that it brought tears to their eyes. Now, while Judge Lord Deas had made it quite clear that no matter what pleas Mary Timney made, she would be executed, of that Lord Deas had no doubt, there were many, many others who did have doubts, and in fact sympathy for Mary Timney's flight, with many believing the sympathy was due to the fact it was a woman who faced a sentence of death, despite the horrendous and brutal attack that Anne Hannah had received, and so petitions in neighbouring towns were started. The petitions received and forwarded to the Home Secretary, who in 1862 was Sir George Grey, included 2,107 male inhabitants of Dumfries and Maxwell Town, 3,187 ladies of Dumfries and Maxwell Town, 100 influential inhabitants of Annan, 579 signatures from Thornhill, and numerous other petitions from Kirkcudbright, New Galloway and Castle Douglas, as well as communications from the member from the Wigton Borough, the member of the Lords of the Treasury, the member of the Stewartry of Kirkcudbright, and the Duke of Argyll. And two ladies even made their way from Dumfries to visit the Home Secretary in England, some 276 miles return journey, to lay down the case and plead for a reprieve for Mary Timney. So there was plenty of support for Mary Timney, Everyone, it would seem, was praying that all the support shown and offered would see Her Majesty get involved to commute the death sentence. However, before any response had been received from the Home Secretary, and before the case had been put in front of Her Majesty, Mary Timney made a shocking confession on the 16th of April, which was printed in full in the Beverley Weekly Recorder and General Advertiser on the 26th of April, 1862. Mary Timney had finally admitted that yes, she had been the one to attack and murder Anne Hannah, but insisted that she had not intended to kill her, that it had not been premeditated, and that Anne had provoked her, and that she had not taken the mallet or beetle from her home, insisting that it had been in Anne's kitchen when she got there. Okay, so a bit different to a not guilty plea, but why? What had Anne done that had provoked her so much that she ended up killing her? Oh, and Mary Timney said that it had been jealousy that had been her motive. So the confession is quite long, so I'll paraphrase. It starts by saying that Mary Timney and her husband had been happily married for 10 years until they came to live in the cottage at Carstfad 2 years prior, as it was upon moving here that Anne Hannah appeared to have an influence over her husband, with Mary stating that this is the reason the two women had had such difficulties getting on, and Mary saying that it was the reason that jealousy started to creep into her mind. She said that on the morning of the attack and murder, she had gone to gather some wood, but had come across Anne, who had apparently said to her, "Are you going to thieve more of our wood?" At this point, Mary said, an altercation, including high words and blows, ensued, before Mary went back to her home. But she said she was still angry about the altercation, and so she had gone to Anne Hannah's home intending to give her a beating, but she stated with no intention of taking her life. Mary Timney said that as soon as she stormed into Anne's kitchen, Anne immediately turned on her and violently kicked her with her clog above her knee, which caused a severe wound, of which the scar was still visible. Mary said that as she bent down to inspect her knee, Anne Hannah had apparently struck Mary Timney on the back with the wooden mallet or beetle that had been within reach, but that Anne dropped the mallet and Mary had picked it up and struck Anne with it, striking her heavily on the side of the head, saying at this point that Anne was stunned, but Mary was in a frenzy now, and she continued to strike Anne again and again with the mallet. When Mary Timney realised that Anne was down on the ground and severely wounded, she left Anne's house, carrying the mallet, not realising she still had it until she was back at her home. Hence why Mary Timney firmly believed that she would receive a reprieve, as clearly she had not gone to Anne's house with the intention of killing her. She merely wanted to give her a beating. So okay, now we have a confession, although as an article in the Dumfries Courier said, very little reliance can be placed upon anything that wretched criminal has said, which I guess is correct. I mean, Anne was not around to corroborate exactly what Mary said, so it was quite easy for Mary Timney to say that it was Anne who had provoked her and who threw the first blow. But it's only Mary Timney's word we've got, and she had already tried to not only blame her mother for Anne's murder, but had lied about being involved in Anne's attack and murder at all. So it's debatable whether you believe what Mary is now saying or not. Amazingly, Mary Timney's supporters did believe her, and despite her now admitting her guilt, their support and persistence to get Mary a reprieve was unwavering. While the Home Secretary made himself familiar with the case, spoke to Judge Lord Deas and other experts, including Her Majesty, who had even sent one of her commissioners in lunacy, Dr. Brown, to see Mary Timney, as one of the letters received by Her Majesty from Mary Timney's supporters suggested that Mary Timney was fatuous or imbecile. But after Dr. Brown visited Mary Timney and had a lengthy conversation with her, he determined that she possessed fully of the average intellect of her class, although destitute of moral training. A debate was raging in newspapers about whether Mary Timney should receive a reprieve or not. Some newspaper articles stated that Mary had shown herself to have a depraved heart and was happy to incriminate the dead and the living, saying that Anne had started the fight. The groundless, horrible story that her own mother had killed Anne defamed her husband by suggesting that he may have been improperly intimate with Anne and brought dishonour on our children, while others stated that the story of what had taken place that fateful day had only come from Mary Timney once she felt herself in the jaws of death, and that she exhibits none of the delicacy of her sex. Although, while stating that their readers will have difficulty in remembering anything so hideous for years, they did not altogether approve of executions, didn't believe that they do any good, and would prefer to see Mary Timney sentenced to a life of incarceration. While another newspaper commented what the fallout would be if Mary Timney was given a reprieve on her death sentence, with an article in the Glasgow Daily Herald on the 16th of April saying that while it had been 35 years since anyone had been hanged in Dumfries, the fact it was now a female that was facing such a sentence was doubly painful, but that was a mere matter of feeling and should not be allowed to affect things, going on to say that they saw no sufficient reason why the law in this case should not be carried out. However, they did believe that this would impact the decision and that it was likely a reprieve would be given to save the wretched woman's life, especially as a reprieve had been given in recent years in London for a female who had been found guilty of murder. The writer of the article clearly felt that if it were a man who had been found guilty of the same murder, no reprieve would have been given, and they didn't feel it right that a reprieve should be given in Mary Timney's case either. The same article went on to say that as a female sovereign currently sat on the throne, she too would find it hard not to sympathise with Mary Timney's plight, and would fight to issue a reprieve, going on to say that this would be more so the case due to Her Majesty's current circumstances. So I wondered what current circumstances the writer was talking about, and it was because the Queen's husband had died in 1861 and Queen Victoria was in mourning and had removed herself from most things in life for a more secluded, sedate life in the Highlands of Scotland. The writer of the same newspaper article in the Glasgow Daily Herald went on to try and predict what may happen in the future if Mary Timney was given a reprieve, something that the Home Secretary was no doubt already thinking about. The article said that if Mary Timney was given a reprieve, that the idea would take root in the public mind that no female criminals will be executed, a consequence, the writer strongly imparted on the reader, that should be regarded with serious apprehension, going on to state that the danger is that should the sentence of the law not be carried out, the Carlsfad may be followed by other murders, that women may not only give free vent to their own hate, but become the instruments of men's rancour, confident in their immunity from the punishment of death. The article ended by saying it is for Sir George Grey to decide whether this risk may be run in order to avoid the painful proceedings of executing a woman. Now, while all of this is going on outside Dumfries Prison, Mary Timney's prison life is anything but content. For the first few days after receiving the death sentence, Mary Timney was reported to be in great mental and physical distress, weeping bitterly, although she did become calmer and more composed by all the support she was receiving, and she carried hope that she would receive a reprieve. She was also receiving much support and guidance from the prison chaplain and spiritual advisor, with it being the chaplain she had initially made a full confession to, although it was reported that she had not expressed any great horror at her crime or any contrition for it. Since making a full confession, it was reported that Mary Timney had been able to sleep and eat well, and had been visited sporadically by her husband and 4 children, and was said to be very tender and affectionate towards them, although each time they had to leave again, Mary Timney would be deeply affected. Mary's children, mother and sister had visited Mary for the last time on the Wednesday before her execution date. Mary hoped and prayed until the 26th of April, when a communication from Sir George Grey was received, which stated the decision he had come to. It stated, according to the Scotsman on the 26th of April, that Sir George Grey could see no grounds for recommending that the capital sentence in Mary Timney's case should be commuted. Therefore, Mary Timney's execution would go ahead in Dumfries between the prison and the courthouse on Tuesday the 29th of April 1862, 3 days later. And just like that, all the hope Mary had been holding on to about getting a reprieve was gone, and Mary Timney, on receiving the news, suffered a severe convulsive fit. But over the next few days she did come to terms with her fate, and then it was the day before her execution, Monday. She was said to have awoken early, although she hadn't been able to sleep much since finding out her fate, but she remained calm most of the day until the early afternoon, when it was reported her pulse sank rapidly, with her being deemed to be physically exhausted, and it being stated by the prison medical officer that had Mary's imprisonment been of much longer endurance, she could not have survived till the morning of her execution. Later on the Monday afternoon, her husband visited her for the last time, where Mary told her husband to bring up her children well and in a godly manner before they parted for the last time, which was said to have been a calm farewell. Mary then sat down and began to dictate letters for her mother and sister, although upon finishing she suffered a violent attack of hysteria, and the prison doctor gave her soothing medicine to help calm her, although the attack lasted for over 2 hours. But by 10 p.m. she had tired herself out and she fell asleep, before waking up again between 5 and 6 a.m. on Tuesday the 29th of April, 1862, execution day. It was reported that she didn't eat any breakfast. Mary was then visited by the prison chaplain, and it was reported that her distraught wailings could be heard resounding through the prison. The scaffold had been erected before daybreak and could be seen from the street. When the death warrant had been handed over, the executioner was prepared and ready, and around 2,500, mainly men, and 200 special constables to prevent disorder, although there was none, were present. It was just before 8 a.m. now. Everyone waited for Mary Timney to appear. When she did, she had her head down and was being heavily supported to walk by 2 men and was moaning heavily. When she looked up and saw the scaffold, she shrank back and wailed louder, crying, "Oh, oh." As she was led to the steps and urged to go up them, she was heard to cry, "Let me stand a minute, I'm weak." As she was being led up the steps to her death, she began to wail and cry, "Oh, my poor wains, my wains, my poor wains, oh, oh." As Mary Timney reached the top of the steps, a prison worker arrived and handed a letter that had a London postmark on it to the prison governor, who stood at the bottom of the scaffold steps. Everything stopped and silence fell while the governor hurriedly opened the letter, with many hoping it was a letter with a reprieve. However, it was not. It was a letter from someone at the Evening Herald in London, requesting that the prison governor telegraph the newspaper an account of the execution so they could add it to the newspaper's afternoon edition. And so the execution carried on. It was reported that Mary hadn't actually seen the delivery of the letter, and so no false hopes were given to her. As Mary stood at the top of the scaffold, waiting for the executioner to put the cap over her face, she briefly looked at the crowd that had gathered, and they in turn looked at her, saying later that she looked bewildered and stupefied with terror, before Mary again was heard to cry, "Oh, my wains, oh, my wains." Mary was then placed on the drop. Her ankles were fastened with a belt, and the cap was drawn over her face, at which point she began to scream, intermingled with crying, "Oh, my poor wains." The rope was then placed around Mary's neck, as Mary continued to scream and cry, "My wains, my wains." Mary was screaming when the bolt was drawn back, and she dropped and began to swing in the air, convulsing, until 27-year-old Mary Timney was dead. Her body was left to hang for half an hour before being removed. Mary Timney was buried within the prison grounds the following day. She had left behind 4 young children. Anne Hannah had been 40 years old. So what do you think? Do you agree that the execution had to go ahead despite the fact it was a woman who was being executed? Or, like the author of the letter sent to and printed in the Dundee Courier and Argus on the 2nd of May, 1862, who thought it surprising and sorrowful that Mary Timney's case should be the only one to have a plea of mercy refused, going on to state that there had been 2 other recent cases in Dundee, being about a 2.5-hour drive north and east of Dumfries, where the death penalties had been reprieved. One being 12 months prior, when a mother had murdered her small child, and the second being a few months prior, when a man had cruelly ill-treated and then killed his wife. The letter went on to say, neither of the culprits in those cases deserved, in my humble opinion, so much the sympathy of the public or favour from the hands of the law as the wretched woman, Mary Timney, who more than fully explained her offence on the scaffold at Dumfries. So what do you think? Do you think too much was made of Mary being a female killer, and therefore she just couldn't be given a reprieve for fear that more women would kill? Or do you think that Mary Timney committed such a brutal attack and murder, whether she was provoked or not, and she needed to be made an example out of? Let me know what you think. I know you might be expecting Scotland Then to be next, but you'll have to wait until next Tuesday for that. This episode is a bit long already, and I've found so much from April 1862 that I want to tell you about, so I've decided to make it its own episode. Also, I might have mentioned this before, but I was recently at CrimeCon in London, and I met so many fantastic people, including some of our listeners, which I really loved. I'm going to give you all a shout out in the Scotland Then episode next week, so don't forget to listen to that episode too. Thanks for listening to another episode of Scottish Murders, the twice award shortlisted fortnightly podcast that brings to light the stories of victims and their relentless pursuit for justice. If this case has captivated you, then don't forget to tell a friend to listen or check out scottishmurders.com so together we can share more Scottish murders. Until next time, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.